The wind howled through the narrow streets of Bamberg, a small German village nestled in the shadow of the Alps, in the autumn of 1626. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and burning leaves. But beneath the crispness lurked something darker, a creeping dread that clung to the cobblestones like morning mist. In a modest cottage at the village's edge, young Anna lay feverish, her small body trembling under a threadbare quilt. Her mother Elizabeth knelt beside her, whispering prayers to a God who seemed to have turned his back. The child's fever had raged for days, her cries piercing the night, and no remedy, neither herb nor leech, could break its grip. The villagers, once warm with neighborly concern, now kept their distance, their eyes darting with suspicion. Whispers slithered through the taverns and market stalls. "This is no ordinary sickness." Bamberg was a tinderbox of fear, its people steeped in tales of demons and divine wrath. The 30 Years' War, raging across Europe, had left fields barren and hearts heavy with uncertainty. In this well-known moment of history, the war's chaos fueled a desperate need for scapegoats, and the Church's warnings about Satan's minions echoed in every sermon. But there was something more sinister at play, an obscure detail few dared to voice the village well. Anna's only source of water had been tainted by a strange, bitter residue, unnoticed by all but the rats that lay dead near its rim. Was it poison neglect, or something unholy? No one asked. Instead, the villagers' gazes turned to Elizabeth, a widow who lived alone, who spoke too boldly, who knew too much of herbs. Her independence was a spark in a world that craved conformity. In the tavern, Hans, the blacksmith, muttered over his ale, his voice low but sharp. "She's cursed the child," he said, his words met with nods from men whose fear outstripped their reason. Greta. The baker's wife clutched her rosary, her thoughts a tangle of guilt and terror. If Elizabeth is a witch, what of my own sins? She wondered, her mind replaying the time she'd envied Elizabeth's garden. The village priest, Father Matthias, fanned the flames from his pulpit, his sermons thick with warnings of Satan's wiles. "God tests us," he thundered, "and we must root out the devil's servants." His words were a match, and the villagers' fear was kindling. By nightfall, a crowd gathered outside Elizabeth's cottage, their torches casting jagged shadows on the walls. "Witch!" they cried, their voices a chorus of rage and despair. Elizabeth stood in her doorway, Anna's frail form in her arms, her eyes defiant, yet brimming with a mother's terror. How did it come to this? She thought, her heart a drumbeat of betrayal. The stars above seemed to dim, as if unwilling to witness what would follow. The crowd's shouts grew louder, their accusations wilder claims of midnight rituals, of pacts with demons. No one spoke of the well of the war, of the hunger that gnawed at their bellies. It was easier to blame a woman than to face the void of their own helplessness. And so, the spark of Anna's illness became a blaze, one that would soon consume not just Elizabeth, but countless others. Did Elizabeth deserve this fate, or was history the crueler judge, twisting grief into a weapon? The shadows lengthened, and Bamberg's quiet streets became a stage for a tragedy that would echo through the ages. In the hallowed halls of the Vatican, where the scent of incense mingled with the weight of centuries, a shadow fell over the Church's soul. It was December 5, 1484, when Pope Innocent VIII, his hands trembling with age and dread, penned the papal bull Summis Desiderantes Affectibus. This decree, a well-known historical fact, declared witchcraft a heretical threat, a cancer gnawing at the heart of Christendom. The Pope's words were a clarion call, urging the faithful to root out the servants of Satan, who he claimed conspired to destroy God's kingdom on earth. The bull's ink was still wet when it was dispatched to every corner of Europe, its message clear: the Church was at war, and the enemy was within. The air in Rome was thick with fear, a paranoia that seeped into the very stones of St. Peter's Basilica. Cardinals and bishops, their robes heavy with gold and gilt, whispered in darkened chambers, their minds clouded by visions of demons and divine wrath. The Church, once a beacon of salvation, now saw shadows in every flicker of candlelight. The Pope himself, haunted by dreams of hellfire, believed that witches were the harbingers of apocalypse, their spells a plague upon the land. But beneath this holy terror lay a darker truth, an obscure detail few dared to acknowledge. The Pope's confessor, a man named Heinrich Kramer, had a personal vendetta against women who defied him. Kramer, a Dominican friar with a heart as cold as the alpine winds, had been scorned by a woman in Innsbruck, and his rage had festered into a crusade. It was he who whispered in the Pope's ear, twisting scripture and stoking fears until the bull was born. The Church's war was not just against Satan, but against those who dared to challenge its earthly power. In the villages, the bull's arrival was like a spark in dry grass. In Bamberg, where Elizabeth's fate hung in the balance, the priest clutched the parchment as if it were a sword. The Holy Father has spoken. He declared, his voice trembling with fervor. We must purge the devil's agents from our midst. The villagers, already teetering on the edge of hysteria, needed little convincing. The Pope's words were law, and law was God's will. Yet, as the witch hunt spread like a plague, consuming lives from the Alps to the Atlantic, a question lingered in the minds of the few who dared to think. Was this truly a battle for souls? Or had the Church become the very monster it sought to slay? The answer, like the truth, was buried beneath layers of fear and faith. The stars above Rome glittered coldly, indifferent to the machinations of men. In the Vatican, Kramer smiled, his eyes gleaming with a zealot's fire. The stage was set, the holy war declared, and the flames of persecution would soon light the night skies of Europe. The Church, in its quest to save the world, had unleashed a darkness of its own making. The year was 1486, and Europe trembled under the weight of a new terror. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478 to root out heresy, had already carved a bloody path through Iberia, its shadow now stretching northward like a claw. This well-known historical fact marked the birth of a relentless machinery of persecution, one that would soon turn its gaze to the so-called witches plaguing Christendom. With Pope Innocent VIII's bull still echoing in the hearts of the faithful, the first witch trials began in the Rhineland, where the air grew heavy with accusation and dread. The machinery of the Inquisition, oiled by fear and sanctified by the Church, was set in motion, and no village, not even Bamberg, would escape its reach. In the town of Innsbruck, where Heinrich Kramer's venom had first taken root, the courtroom was a theater of shadows. The accused, a healer named Margaret, stood trembling before a tribunal of stone-faced clerics, her hands bound with coarse rope. The judges, cloaked in the authority of God, demanded confessions of devilish pacts, their questions sharp as blades. Margaret's crime. A neighbor claimed to have seen her spirit, a ghostly specter, dancing in the moonlight with demons. This obscure detail, the use of spectral evidence, was a chilling innovation of the early trials, allowing accusers to condemn based on visions no one else could verify. The court accepted the testimony without question, for who could doubt the eyes of a God-fearing soul? Margaret's pleas, her tear-streaked denials, were drowned by the clamor of a crowd, hungry for justice or vengeance. I am no witch. She thought, her heart a storm of fear and defiance. But who will believe me when the devil himself is my accuser? The trial's outcome was a foregone conclusion. The judges, their minds steeped in Kramer's teachings, saw Satan in every shadow, every misfortune. A failed harvest, a sick child, a sudden storm, all were proof of witchcraft, and Margaret was the scapegoat. The crowd outside the courthouse roared their voices, a tide of rage echoing the sermons that had poured from pulpits across Europe. In Bamberg, Father Matthias heard of Innsbruck's verdict and tightened his grip on his rosary, his thoughts a tangle of duty and doubt. If the Pope wills it, who am I to question? He wondered, yet a flicker of unease stirred within him. The machinery of persecution was not just a tool of the Church. It was a beast with a life of its own, devouring the innocent alongside the guilty. As Margaret was led to the pyre, the stars above seemed to turn away their light, too weak to pierce the smoke that would soon rise. The trial had set a precedent, a blueprint for thousands more to come. From Innsbruck to Würzburg, the witch hunts would spread, each accusation feeding the next, each execution stoking the flames of fear. The question lingered heavy as the chains that bound the accused. Did the pursuit of divine justice sanctify the destruction of human lives? Or had the Church's zeal blinded it to the truth? The dawn of the Inquisition was not a sunrise, but a twilight, casting long shadows over a continent on the brink of madness. In the shadowed depths of Bamberg's fortress, the air hung heavy with despair. Dank stone walls swallowed the cries of the accused, their fates sealed by whispers of witchcraft. Elizabeth, a mother whose only crime was a sick child in a fearful village, now dangled from the strappado. Her wrists were bound behind her, the rope hoisted by a creaking pulley, until her feet barely brushed the floor. Each jerk of the rope twisted her shoulders, her body trembling under the strain. The strappado, a notorious tool of the witch hunts, turned human endurance into a cruel spectacle, breaking bones and spirits alike. Elizabeth's mind reeled. How had it come to this? The interrogators loomed over her, their voices sharp and unyielding. "Confess your sins," they barked, "and name your accomplices." Silence was her rebellion, but it came at a cost. Beyond the physical torment, a subtler cruelty gnawed at her the promise of mercy. "Speak, and you'll be spared," one whispered, his tone deceptively soft. It was a lie, a psychological snare. Few knew of confessions, rarely brought salvation, only more names to feed the trials. Yet, in the haze of pain, even a false hope felt like a lifeline. Elizabeth's resolve wavered, her thoughts a tangle of fear and longing for an end. The witch hunt spread like a plague across Europe, from Bamberg's grim cells to the shadowed dungeons of Würzburg and beyond. Instruments of anguish, the rack thumbscrews, the strappado, became the Church's unholy allies, each confession stoking the fires of paranoia. Father Matthias, once a fiery voice against heresy, stood outside the fortress, his faith shaken. The screams haunted him, a relentless echo that drowned out his prayers. Was this justice, or had they lost their way? The confessions wrenched from broken bodies were frail threads of truth, yet they lit the pyres that consumed thousands. Above, the night sky glittered cold and distant. Elizabeth's strength ebbed, her body a fragile shell. If I confess, will it stop? She wondered, the question a flicker in her fading mind. But another lingered, deeper and more troubling. Did the accusers believe these tortured words, or were they just fuel for their righteous fury? The dungeon door groaned open, and the interrogators returned, their resolve as unyielding as the stone around them. For Elizabeth and countless others, the embrace of torture offered no escape, only the promise of flames to come. In the frost-bitten winter of 1487, a book emerged from the presses of Speyer, its pages heavy with a darkness that would stain Europe for centuries. The Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, penned by Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, was published, a well-known historical fact that marked a turning point in the witch hunts. This tome, cloaked in the authority of the Church, was no mere theological treatise. It was a blueprint for annihilation, a guide to identifying, interrogating, and destroying those accused of witchcraft. Its words, sharp as a blade, sliced through the fabric of communities like Bamberg, where Elizabeth's cries still echoed in the fortress dungeons, and gave divine sanction to the terror that gripped the continent. The Malleus was a venomous creation, its ink infused with Kramer's personal vendetta against women who defied him. Its chapters wove a chilling narrative. Witches were real, their powers a threat to God's order, and they must be eradicated at all costs. But buried within its pages was an obscure detail that revealed its true malice, a relentless obsession with women's supposed weakness, claiming their carnal lust and feeble minds made them natural allies of Satan. This misogyny was no accident. It was a weapon turning every woman, widow, healer, or outspoken neighbor into a suspect. In Bamberg, Father Matthias clutched his copy of the Malleus, its weight a comfort and a curse. If the book speaks truth, he thought, then no one is safe. Yet, as he read of witches flying to Sabbaths and cursing crops, a flicker of doubt stirred within him. Could words alone justify such horror? Across Europe, the Malleus spread like wildfire, its influence seeping into courtrooms and pulpits. Judges in Innsbruck, where Margaret had faced spectral accusations, now cited its passages to justify their verdicts. Interrogators in Würzburg, their hands stained with the despair of the tortured, found in its pages a script for extracting confessions. The book's authority was unquestioned, its logic a trap. If a woman denied witchcraft, she was lying. If she confessed, she was damned. In Bamberg, the tavern buzzed with fear, as Hans the blacksmith whispered of the book's warnings, his eyes darting to every shadow. Greta, the baker's wife, felt the Malleus's gaze upon her, her every action now a potential sin. Am I a witch? For doubting, she wondered, her heart a knot of guilt and terror. The stars above Spire glimmered faintly, as if mourning the world below. The Malleus had not just armed the witch hunters, it had reshaped reality, turning neighbors into spies and mercy into suspicion. Its words were a spark igniting pyres from the Rhineland to the Alps, and its legacy would haunt the dreams of the innocent. As the book's shadow lengthened, a question lingered sharp and unyielding. Did the Malleus uncover a hidden evil, or did its words create the very monsters it sought to destroy? The answer, like the truth, was lost in the smoke of 1,000 fires, but the Malleus remained a Bible for those who hunted in God's name. The wind that swept through Würzburg in the autumn of 1626 carried the scent of smoke and sorrow. The city, once a jewel of the Holy Roman Empire, had become a cauldron of fear, its streets haunted by the specter of witchcraft. The witch hunts which had ignited in nearby Bamberg now raged like an inferno across the region, their flames licking at the very soul of Würzburg. Between 1626 and 1631, the Würzburg witch trials, a grim chapter etched into history, claimed the lives of hundreds, their executions a relentless tide that drowned the innocent alongside the accused. The trials unfolded with a ferocity that left the city trembling, as if the ground itself recoiled from the weight of its own sins. In the shadow of Würzburg's courthouse, terror took root. The judges, their faces carved with exhaustion and zeal, clutched the Malleus Maleficarum, that infamous manual of witch hunting, as though it were a sacred relic. Its words fueled the accusations that spiraled through the city, ensnaring not only women and men, but also children. Some were as young as 3 years old, their fragile lives snuffed out in a hysteria so profound it defied reason. This haunting detail, the execution of toddlers alongside their kin, revealed the depths to which fear had driven Würzburg. The marketplace, once alive with the chatter of merchants and the aroma of warm bread, now hosted pyres that burned ceaselessly, their smoke a dark veil over a city unmade. The people of Würzburg, bound once by faith and fellowship, became strangers to one another. Fear turned neighbors into accusers, their whispered suspicions a prelude to death. Hans, a blacksmith, who had fled Bamberg's chaos, found no refuge here. His tales of curses now mirrored the paranoia around him. Greta, a baker's wife, clung to her rosary, her prayers drowned by the crackle of flames. Yet, amid the chaos, a question gnawed at the hearts of the few who dared to reflect. How could a society that claimed to be guided by Christian values condone the execution of children? The answer eluded them, buried beneath a tide of panic and piety that swept away compassion. Father Matthias, a weary priest who had sought peace in Würzburg after Bamberg's horrors, wandered its streets like a ghost. The screams of the condemned pierced his soul, their faces young and old, blurring into a tapestry of suffering. Is this God's will, or have we become the devil's pawns? He wondered, his faith fraying with each step. The witch hunts had spread like a contagion from Bamberg to Würzburg, their tendrils tightening around every life they touched. Above the stars shone with cold indifference, bearing witness to a nightmare that showed no signs of ending. The pyres blazed on their light, a harbinger of the greater darkness yet to come. The twilight skies over Trier in 1587 were streaked with crimson, as if the heavens themselves wept for the women who bore the brunt of the witch hunt's wrath. Across Europe, from Bamberg's smoke-choked streets to Würzburg's pyres, a chilling pattern had emerged. Approximately 80% of those accused and executed for witchcraft were women, a well-known historical fact that revealed the hunt's gendered venom. The Malleus Maleficarum, with its venomous claims about women's susceptibility to Satan, had cast a long shadow, transforming mothers, daughters, and widows into the primary targets of a society gripped by fear. In Trier, where the trials burned with unrelenting fury, the air grew thick with dread, and every woman felt the weight of unseen eyes upon her. Among the accused was Clara, a midwife, whose hands had ushered countless lives into the world. Her crime was not a spell or a curse, but her knowledge, her quiet confidence in the mysteries of childbirth, a realm men could neither control nor fully understand. This obscure detail, the targeting of midwives for their expertise, exposed the hunt's deeper truth. Women who defied the boundaries of their prescribed roles were a threat to the fragile order of a world unraveling. Clara's neighbors, once grateful for her skill, now whispered of devilish pacts, their gratitude curdled by the Malleus's warnings. "She knows too much." They muttered, their voices a chorus of betrayal. Clara stood in the courtroom, her weathered hands trembling, her thoughts a storm of anguish. "I brought their children into the light," she thought, "and now they cast me into darkness." The witch hunts thrived on this fear of women who dared to be different. In Bamberg, Elizabeth's independence had marked her for doom. In Würzburg, the pyres had claimed women whose only sin was their strength. Trier was no different. The judges, their faces carved with righteous zeal, cited the Malleus as they condemned Clara, their words a litany of misogyny dressed in divine authority. The crowd outside, a sea of familiar faces, turned hostile, roared for justice, their fear of the unknown outweighing their memories of Clara's kindness. Greta, who had fled Würzburg's horrors, now watched from the edges, her heart heavy with recognition. It could be me next, she thought, her fingers clutching the rosary that offered no comfort. Even Father Matthias, passing through Trier on his weary pilgrimage, felt the sting of this injustice. How many more must fall before we see the truth? He wondered, his faith a fragile thread stretched to breaking. The stars above Trier glimmered faintly, their light a distant promise of mercy in a world consumed by suspicion. Clara's fate was sealed, her name added to the endless roll of women sacrificed to a society that feared their power. The witch hunts, fueled by the Malleus and sanctified by the Church, had turned daughters into demons, their strength twisted into proof of evil. As the pyres prepared to claim another life, a question lingered, sharp and unyielding. Did society fear witches, or did it fear the women who refused to bow? The answer, like the smoke rising from Trier's flames, drifted beyond reach, leaving only the echo of lives lost to a world too afraid to see them clearly. In the shadowed halls of Bamberg's episcopal palace, where candlelight danced on gilded walls, a darker ambition festered. The year was 1627, and Prince Bishop Johann Georg II Fuchs von Dornheim, a man whose piety masked a hunger for control, reigned over the city with an iron grip. His role in escalating Bamberg's witch hunts, a well-known historical fact, turned the city into a crucible of terror where accusations served not only God, but also the prince bishop's earthly desires. The witch hunts, once a spark of village fear, had become a tool in the hands of rulers like him, a weapon to silence dissent and tighten their hold on power. Bamberg, still reeling from Elizabeth's torment, now faced a new kind of darkness, one orchestrated from above. Johann Georg's court was a theater of intrigue, where loyalty was fragile and enemies lurked in every shadow. To eliminate his rivals, he employed a chilling tactic: anonymous denunciations, an obscure detail that allowed accusers to name foes without proof or consequence. A whispered name slipped into a sealed letter could doom a wealthy merchant, a defiant noble, or a priest who questioned the prince-bishop's zeal. These accusations, cloaked in the sanctity of the Malleus Maleficarum, were unassailable. To doubt them was to doubt God himself. In Bamberg's taverns, Hans the blacksmith, now a broken man, heard rumors of counselors and clergy dragged to the dungeons, their lands seized before the pyres even cooled. Who is safe when power plays the judge? He thought, his hands trembling as he gripped his ale. The prince-bishop's ambition cast a long shadow stretching beyond Bamberg to Würzburg and Trier, where rulers saw the hunts as a path to dominance. In Würzburg, the executions of children had chilled the city, but here, Johann Georg targeted the prosperous, their wealth fueling his coffers. Clara's fate in Trier, a midwife, condemned for her knowledge, echoed in Bamberg's new victims, men and women whose influence threatened the prince-bishop's rule. The trials were a masquerade of justice, each conviction a step toward absolute control. Greta, who had fled Würzburg's flames, now hid in Bamberg's outskirts, her heart heavy with the realization that no one was spared, not the poor, not the powerful. Is this God's will or man's greed, she wondered her prayers, faltering under the weight of truth. Father Matthias, his soul worn thin by the horrors he had witnessed, stood outside the palace, his eyes fixed on its towering spires. The screams from the fortress dungeons haunted him, a reminder of Elizabeth's suffering and the countless others who followed. How far will they twist faith to serve power? He thought his faith a flickering ember in a storm. The stars above Bamberg glimmered coldly, as if bearing witness to a game where human lives were pawns. Johann Georg's witch hunts were not just a war against Satan. They were a calculated purge, a dark game where fear was the currency and power the prize. As the pyres blazed, a question lingered sharp as a blade. Did these rulers serve divine justice, or did they wield fear to carve their own empires? The answer, like the smoke curling skyward, was lost in the shadows of ambition. In the shadowed cloisters of a Jesuit college in Cologne, where the Rhine's murmur mingled with the flicker of candlelight, a quiet rebellion stirred. It was 1630, and the witch hunts raging from Bamberg's pyres to Würzburg's nightmare and Trier's gendered purge had left Europe's soul scarred. Amid this madness, Friedrich Spee von Langenfeld, a Jesuit priest and poet, emerged as a voice of reason. His skepticism of the witch trials, a well-known historical fact that would later shape his seminal work, Cautio Criminalis. Spee, who had witnessed the torment of the accused, could no longer reconcile the Church's actions with the mercy he preached. His heart, heavy with grief, became a beacon in a world blinded by fear. Spee's doubts were born in the confessionals of Würzburg, where he heard the broken voices of the condemned women, like Clara, midwives and mothers, and even children, their confessions wrenched by torture. The Malleus Maleficarum, once a guiding star for zealots like Bamberg's Prince-Bishop Johann Georg, now seemed to Spee a book of lies, its claims of demonic pacts crumbling under scrutiny. But his resistance took a subtler form. An obscure detail lost to most histories, Spee penned anonymous tracts, questioning the trial's justice, and entrusted them to trusted couriers, who slipped them into the hands of scholars and clergy. These writings, passed in secret, under the noses of inquisitors, were sparks of defiance, each word a risk that could lead him to the pyre. If I speak, will it matter? He thought, his quill trembling over parchment, or will I join the flames I seek to douse in Bamberg, where Elizabeth's fate had ignited the hunts? Spee's ideas found fertile ground among a few weary souls. Father Matthias, his faith frayed by the screams of the tortured, stumbled upon one of Spee's tracts, its words a mirror to his own doubts. Could one voice pierce this darkness? He wondered, his hands clutching the forbidden pages, as if they were a lifeline. Yet fear held him back. To speak out was to invite accusation, as Trier's judges and Würzburg's executioners had made clear. Greta, now a shadow of herself, heard whispers of Spee's ideas in a Cologne tavern, her heart stirring with a hope she scarcely dared to name. If even a priest questions might there be salvation, she thought her rosary a cold weight in her hands. But the hunts rolled on their momentum, a tide that drowned dissent. The stars above Cologne glimmered with a fragile light, as if urging Spee to persevere. His tracks, though few, planted seeds of doubt, challenging the dogma that had fueled the Malleus and empowered men like Johann Georg. In a world where silence was safety, Spee's courage was a quiet thunder, a whisper of reason against a cacophony of fear. Yet, as the pyres continued to burn, a question lingered sharp and unyielding. Did those who questioned the hunts show true courage, or did their silence make them complicit in the horror? The answer, like the river flowing past Cologne, slipped through the fingers of history, leaving only the echo of voices too few to stem the tide. The winds of change whispered through the cobblestone streets of Europe in the early 1640s, carrying a faint promise of reprieve. In England, the Parliament of 1641 passed an act that tightened the rules for witchcraft prosecutions, a well-known historical fact that marked a turning point in the slow unraveling of the witch hunt's grip. This legal shift, born of growing skepticism and exhaustion, signaled a crack in the edifice of fear that had consumed Bamberg, Würzburg, Trier, and beyond. The pyres that had blazed for decades began to flicker their flames, weakened by voices like Friedrich Spee's, whose tracks from Cologne had sown seeds of doubt. Yet the tide's turning was neither swift nor certain, and the shadow of the Malleus Maleficarum still loomed large. In the quiet courtrooms of the Rhineland, a subtler revolution unfolded, one history scarcely records. Skeptical judges, their consciences stirred by the likes of Spee, began to dismiss cases with little fanfare, an obscure detail that saved countless lives. These men, cloaked in the robes of authority, saw through the flimsy accusations, spectral evidence, tortured confessions, and whispered denunciations, and chose mercy over zeal. In a small tribunal near Trier, Judge Wilhelm Adler, who had read Spee's forbidden words, stared into the eyes of an accused widow, Anna, and saw not a witch, but a woman broken by loss. "How many have we condemned on lies?" He thought, his quill hesitating over the verdict. His quiet dismissal of her case, citing insufficient proof, was a spark of hope in a world still scarred by fear. In Bamberg, where Elizabeth's tragedy had ignited the hunts, the air felt lighter, though the scars remained. Father Matthias, now gray and stooped, preached with a new conviction, his sermons echoing Spee's call for reason. "Can we rebuild what we've destroyed?" he wondered, his voice trembling as he faced a congregation still haunted by their own complicity. Greta, who had carried the weight of Würzburg's horrors to Cologne and beyond, found herself in a village where accusations were met with shrugs rather than torches. Is it truly over? She thought, her rosary no longer a shield, but a reminder of her survival. Yet, even as legal reforms spread and judges grew bolder, fear lingered like a stubborn fog, ready to flare at the slightest provocation. The stars above the Rhineland glimmered with a cautious optimism, their light a faint guide for a continent weary of its own cruelty. The witch hunts, once an unstoppable force, were faltering, undermined by laws and consciences that refused to bend. From England to the Holy Roman Empire, the machinery of persecution groaned under the weight of its own excesses, its fuel blind faith and panic running low. But as the tide turned, a question lingered sharp and unyielding. Could reason truly banish the fear that birthed the witch hunts? Or would it merely slumber, waiting for a new spark? The answer, like the embers of a dying pyre, glowed faintly, a warning to those who dared to hope for a brighter dawn. In the quiet town of Glarus, nestled in the Swiss Alps, the year 1782 cast a long shadow over a world struggling to shed its past. The trial of Anna Goldie, a maid accused of witchcraft, marked a grim milestone, a well-known historical fact, often cited as Europe's last legal witch execution. Her death by beheading, rather than the pyres of Bamberg or Würzburg, was a muted echo of the terror that had consumed the continent for centuries. The era of the witch hunts, once a wildfire fed by the Malleus Maleficarum and fanned by men like Bamberg's Prince Bishop Johann Georg, was drawing to a close. Yet, as the final flames of persecution flickered, their embers revealed a world still haunted by fear. Anna Goldie's trial was a relic of a fading madness, Accused of poisoning her employer's child with supernatural means, she faced a courtroom where reason clashed with superstition. The judges, unlike the skeptical Wilhelm Adler of the Rhineland, clung to old fears. Their verdict, a nod to the paranoia that had doomed Elizabeth in Bamberg and Clara in Trier. Anna's thoughts as she stood before her accusers were a storm of defiance and despair. Why me, when the world has moved on? She wondered, her heart heavy with the weight of a dying era. But even as legal reforms, inspired by voices like Friedrich Spaes, had dismantled the machinery of the hunts, an obscure detail persisted. Folk beliefs in witchcraft lingered in the shadows of rural life. Villagers in Glarus still whispered of curses and charms, their superstitions a stubborn root that no law could fully uproot. In Bamberg, where the hunts had begun with Elizabeth's tragedy, the scars of the past were etched into the stones of the fortress. Father Matthias, now an old man, walked its streets, his sermons softer, his faith tempered by the memory of Spee's courage. Have we truly learned, he thought, his eyes tracing the horizon where pyres once blazed. Greta, who had carried the weight of Würzburg's horrors through Trier and Cologne, settled in a village near Glarus, her rosary now a token of endurance rather than fear. She heard of Anna's fate and wept, recognizing the same betrayal that had haunted her journey. It's over, but at what cost? She wondered, her heart a tapestry of survival and sorrow. The trials were ending, but their echoes lingered in every town that had tasted the smoke of the pyres. The stars above Glarus shone with a quiet resolve, as if bearing witness to the end of an age. Anna Goldie's execution was a final gasp of a terror that had claimed countless lives, from the children of Würzburg to the midwives of Trier. The laws had changed, the malleus had lost its grip, and the voices of reason had prevailed, but the wounds remained. As the era of the witch hunts faded, a question lingered, sharp and unyielding. Could the end of the trials erase the fear that birthed them, or would their legacy smolder in the hearts of generations to come? The answer, like the wind sweeping through Glarus, carried both hope and warning, a reminder of a darkness that had burned too long. The fields around Bamberg lay fallow in the spring of 1783, their once lush expanses choked with weeds and silence. The witch hunts which had ravaged Europe, from Würzburg's pyres to Trier's gendered purges, and Glarus's final execution of Anna Goldie, had left more than graves in their wake. In Bamberg, the relentless trials orchestrated by Prince Bishop Johann Georg II Fuchs von Dornheim had gutted the region's economy, a well-known historical fact that saw trade falter, markets empty, and villages teeter on the brink of collapse. The hands that once tilled the soil, wove cloth, and forged iron, were gone, burned, banished or broken by fear, leaving communities like ghosts of their former selves, their vitality drained by a terror that had consumed both body and soul. The devastation was not merely a matter of lost lives, but of a deeper, quieter ruin. Farmers, gripped by paranoia, had abandoned their fields, believing the land itself cursed by witches' spells, an obscure detail that turned fertile acres into wastelands. In Bamberg, where Elizabeth's tragedy had sparked the hunts, the once bustling marketplace stood desolate, its stalls boarded up, its cobblestones worn by footsteps that no longer came. Hans the blacksmith, who had fled Bamberg's chaos only to find it mirrored elsewhere, returned to find his forge cold. His customers vanished. What have we done to ourselves? He thought, his hands idle, his heart heavy with the weight of a town unmade. The loss of midwives like Clara in Trier and laborers across Würzburg had severed the arteries of commerce, leaving villages to wither in the shadow of their own fear. Greta, who had carried the scars of Würzburg and Trier through her wanderings, now stood at Bamberg's edge, gazing at the abandoned fields. The rosary in her hands, once a shield against dread, now felt like a relic of a world that had betrayed her. We burned our future for nothing, she thought, her eyes tracing the horizon, where smoke no longer rose, but ruin lingered. Father Matthias, his body frail, but his spirit unbroken, walked among the empty homes, his sermons now pleas for rebuilding. Can we sow hope where we reaped despair? He wondered, his voice lost in the wind that swept through a town too broken to listen. The economic toll was a wound that cut deeper than any pyre starving the living, as surely as the hunts had claimed the dead. The stars above Bamberg glimmered faintly, their light a distant echo of the world that once was. The witch hunts had not only stolen lives, but livelihoods, tearing the fabric of communities from Glarus to Cologne. The Malleus Maleficarum, which had fueled this destruction, lay forgotten in dusty libraries, its power spent, but its legacy etched in empty fields and silent forges. As Bamberg and its kin faced the slow task of recovery, a question lingered sharp and unyielding. Could the cost of fear measured in lives and labor lost ever be repaid, or would its debt burden generations yet to come? The answer, like the weeds claiming the land, grew wild and untamed, a reminder of a madness that had shattered more than hearts. In the quiet of a Bamberg night in 1784, the stars seemed to tremble, as if unwilling to shine on a world still heavy with grief. The witch hunts, which had scorched Europe from Würzburg's pyres to Trier's gendered purges, and Glarus's final execution of Anna Goldie, had left more than economic ruin in their wake. The social trauma they inflicted, a well-known historical fact, lingered like a poison in the hearts of survivors and witnesses, reshaping communities into haunted landscapes of memory. In Bamberg, where Elizabeth's fate had ignited the terror, the streets were silent, but the minds of those who remained were loud with echoes of screams and smoke. The hunts were over, but their shadows clung to every soul who had lived through the madness. Greta, now settled in a modest cottage on Bamberg's outskirts, woke nightly to the same torment dreams of flames that danced with the faces of the condemned Clara Elizabeth and countless others. These witch hunt nightmares, an obscure detail whispered among survivors, plagued many who had seen the pyres or heard the accusations. In Greta's dreams, the rosary she clutched became a chain binding her to a past she could not escape. "Will I ever know peace?" she thought, her hands trembling, as dawn broke her heart, a battlefield of guilt and survival. She was not alone. Across Würzburg, Trier, and beyond, men and women carried invisible scars. Their trust in neighbors shattered, their faith in justice eroded by the memory of trials that spared no one. Father Matthias, his body bent by years, and sorrow wandered Bamberg's churchyard, his prayers interrupted by visions of the fortress dungeons. The screams of the tortured, the zeal of men like Prince Bishop Johann Georg, and the weight of his own silence haunted him. How do we heal when the wounds are in our souls, he wondered, his eyes tracing the graves of those who had perished. The trauma was a shared burden, binding survivors like Greta and Matthias to a collective grief that no sermon could soothe. Even Hans the blacksmith, who had returned to a ruined forge, found no solace in work. His hands faltered, his mind replaying the accusations he had once echoed in Bamberg's tavern. Did I help light those fires? He thought, his guilt a stone in his chest. The stars above Bamberg glimmered faintly, their light a fragile comfort in a world marked by loss. The witch hunts had not only claimed lives, but had fractured the very fabric of human connection, leaving communities to grapple with a legacy of fear and betrayal. From Glarus to Cologne, the psychological scars ran deep, a silent epidemic that no law could cure. The Malleus Maleficarum, once a spark for this horror, lay discarded, but its influence lingered in the nightmares that plagued the living. As survivors faced the slow task of rebuilding their lives, a question lingered sharp and unyielding. Could a society scarred by such terror ever truly heal? Or would its trauma echo through time, a ghost that refused to rest? The answer, like the wind carrying Greta's sleepless sighs, was a whisper of both hope and sorrow. In the crisp air of a Bamberg morning in 2015, a gentle breeze stirred the leaves, carrying whispers of a past that refused to be forgotten. Across Europe, from the windswept cliffs of Varda, Norway, to the quiet squares of Trier, modern memorials rose like sentinels, their stones bearing witness to the victims of the witch hunts. The Stilneset Memorial in Vardo, unveiled in 2011 to honor the 91 executed in Finnmark's 17th-century trials, stood as a well-known testament to this resolve, a stark, elegant structure of light and shadow. Its flames caged in glass to symbolize a terror contained but never erased. These monuments scattered across the lands, once scorched by Bamberg's pyres. Würzburg's nightmare and Glaris's final execution of Anna Goldi urged the living to remember to learn and to guard against the darkness that had consumed so many. In Bamberg, a modest plaque was unveiled near the old fortress, its surface etched with names, Elizabeth among them, whose lives had been stolen by fear, and the Malleus Maleficarum. This obscure detail, the careful inscription of victims' names in lesser-known memorials, gave individuality to the countless lost, pulling them from the anonymity of history's shadow. Greta, now an old woman, stood before the plaque, her fingers tracing the letters of Elizabeth's name, her eyes clouded with tears and time. Do they see us, these souls we honor? She thought her rosary a quiet weight in her pocket, no longer a shield, but a bridge to the past. The memorial was not just stone. It was a mirror reflecting the pain of Würzburg's children, Trier's midwives, and the countless others who had faced the flames. Father Matthias had not lived to see this day. His weary heart stilled decades ago. But his spirit seemed to linger in the crowd that gathered descendants, historians, and survivors like Greta united in remembrance. The memorials from Vardo to Trier were more than markers. They were warnings, their presence a challenge to a world that had moved on, but not forgotten. In Würzburg, a sculpture of broken chains stood in the marketplace, its form a silent apology for the lives shattered by zeal. In Glaris, a stone for Anna Goldi gleamed under the alpine sun, its inscription a plea for forgiveness. Can we honor the dead without confronting our own flaws? Greta wondered, her heart heavy with the weight of survival and the nightmares that still haunted her sleep. The stars above Bamberg, now joined by the soft glow of streetlights, cast a gentle light on the plaque, as if blessing the act of remembrance. The witch hunts which had torn through Europe with the fury of a tempest had left scars that time could not fully heal. But these memorials offered a kind of solace, a promise that the stories of Elizabeth Clara and Anna would not fade. As visitors paused to read the names, a question lingered sharp and unyielding. Can stone and memory keep us from repeating the sins of the past, or do they merely mark the graves of lessons unlearned? The answer, like the breeze that carried Greta's sigh, was a whisper of hope, urging the world to listen before the shadows stirred again. In the quiet of a modern Bamberg evening, where streetlights cast golden pools on cobblestones, once stained by fear, the echoes of the witch hunts lingered like a half-remembered dream. The trials, which historians estimate claimed some 50,000 lives across Europe, a well-known historical fact, had left an indelible mark, their scars etched not only in the stones of Bamberg, Würzburg, Trier, and Glaris, but in the collective soul of humanity. From Elizabeth's tragedy in Bamberg to Anna Goldi's execution in Glaris, the hunts had been a tempest of paranoia fueled by the Malleus Maleficarum and wielded by men like Prince Bishop Johann Georg. Yet as the memorials rose and the pyres faded, the past called to the present, urging a reckoning with the darkness that had driven such horror. The witch hunts were gone, but their language persisted, an obscure detail woven into the fabric of modern speech. Phrases like witch hunt and burning at the stake lived on casual metaphors for persecution and blamed their origins half forgotten by those who spoke them. In Bamberg's marketplace, a young woman named Lena, a descendant of Greta's line, paused before the plaque honoring Elizabeth, her fingers tracing the names as Greta once had. How close are we to repeating this? She thought, her heart stirred by stories of her ancestors' survival, her mind haunted by news of modern scapegoats and mob justice. The memorials from Vardo's caged flames to Trier's broken chains stood as sentinels, but their warnings were only as strong as the will to heed them. Greta's memory, though faded, lived in Lena's resolve to teach, to speak, to challenge the fear that still simmered in human hearts. The trauma of Würzburg's children, the betrayal of Trier's midwives, and the economic ruin of Bamberg were not just history, they were mirrors reflecting the fragility of reason in the face of panic. The stars above Bamberg shone with a steady light, as if inviting reflection, a chance to learn from the past's mistakes. The witch hunts had shown humanity's capacity for cruelty, but also its potential for change, as seen in the courage of Friedrich Spee and the quiet mercy of judges like Wilhelm Adler. As Lena walked away, a question lingered sharp and unyielding. Can we confront the darkness within ourselves, or will fear forever tempt us to light new pyres? The answer, like the future, hung in the balance, a challenge to build a world where shadows no longer ruled. As the night deepens over, Bamberg, let the stars cradle your thoughts. Dear listener, and soften the weight of this tale. The witch hunts with their flames and fears are but echoes now, their voices hushed by time's gentle hand. Imagine Greta, her rosary at rest, finding peace in a world that learned to heal. Picture Elizabeth, Clara, and Anna. Their names carved in stone, their spirits no longer bound by chains of accusation. The memorials stand not to haunt, but to guide their stones, a promise that we can choose compassion over cruelty, reason over rage. Feel the breeze that stirs Bamberg's streets, carrying away the smoke of old pyres, whispering of hope, of lessons learned, of a future where no one must fear the shadow of another's blame. Rest now. Let the past sorrow fade like a dream, and hold fast to the light that dawns with every new day. The tale fades. Let the shadows lull you to sleep.